The day my father fell from his horse and died, all of Flagstaff was shaken. On the day the will was read, the lawyer's voice rang clear. My older brother, Marshall Boone, inherited the entire ranch, the estates, and the Grand Boone mansion. And I was left with only an old, dilapidated wooden cabin. The entire room erupted in mocking laughter. In front of my mother, relatives, and my wife's family, I was ridiculed as a useless, penniless failure. My wife turned her back and walked away, leaving me in a humiliation I had never known. But they didn't know that the abandoned cabin held a secret powerful enough to turn everything upside down. Hello, my name is Stetson Boone. I'm 32 years old, living in Flagstaff, Arizona, a small town nestled among snow-capped mountains and endless sprawling fields. I'm a veterinarian, a job I love to my core. My days begin with the familiar smell of antiseptic tending to animals, from town dogs and cats to cattle and horses on local ranches. They don't lie, don't betray, they only need care. But if you think my life is a serene picture, you're mistaken. My story begins with deep cracks in my family, with contemptuous glances, and with a fateful day that changed everything. I was born into a wealthy family, one where the name Boone was synonymous with power, land, and money in this part of the West. Our family owned cattle ranches, horse farms, and estates spanning tens of thousands of acres. My father, Jerome Boone, was a renowned businessman, a man respected across the region. Tall and imposing, with a booming voice like thunder and piercing eyes that could make anyone shiver, he was generous to the community, building schools, funding hospitals, and hosting grand parties for the town during holidays. But with his children, he was a stern, almost harsh father. He always said, "A man without ambition isn't worthy of the Boone name." I'm the youngest in the family, living under the towering shadow of my older brother, Marshall Boone. 3 years my senior, Marshall was everything my father wanted: ambitious, sharp, and unrelenting. He had a confident smile, a charismatic way of speaking, and a business acumen that made my father proud. Even as a teenager, Marshall was given chances to prove himself, managing a small section of the ranch under supervision, negotiating minor deals, even speaking on our father's behalf at community meetings to build his image as the heir. In everyone's eyes, Marshall was the designated successor from early on. And me? I was just the lazy younger brother in his eyes, a guy who wandered the fields, petted horses, and healed injured cows instead of dreaming about expanding the Boone empire. I remember summer afternoons as a kid, sitting on a wooden fence watching my father and Marshall ride across the fields. My father would pat Marshall's shoulder, talking about the family's future, while I got only a fleeting glance and a cold remark: "Stetson, stop daydreaming and do something useful." Marshall would smirk, adding a jab: "Let him play with the stray dogs, Dad. He'll never amount to anything." Though they were just harsh words from an ambitious brother, they cut deep into my heart like wounds that wouldn't heal. I didn't want to compete, didn't want to be a carbon copy of Marshall. I just wanted to be myself, someone who loved the land, loved animals, and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But it wasn't just my father and Marshall who shaped me in the family. My mother, Margaret Boone, was a quiet anchor, keeping the family's flame alive. She was a strong woman with sharp eyes that always held a hint of gentleness. She didn't speak much, but every word carried weight, forged from integrity and unconditional love. To her, Marshall and I were two pieces of her heart, neither greater nor lesser. She was proud of Marshall's sharpness, but valued my simplicity just as much. I remember the nights when my father scolded me for falling short of his expectations. She would sit by me, stroke my hair, and say, "You're Stetson, not Marshall, and I love you for that." But she was also fair, never letting love cloud her honesty. When Marshall boasted too much, she gently reminded him of humility. To her, the Boone family wasn't just about wealth or fame. It was about living true to one's values. I always felt her love, but sometimes I wondered if she grew tired of being the bridge between my brother and me, between me and my father's harsh expectations. My life wasn't just about the wealthy family with vast ranches. After growing up and starting work, I married Alora, a woman I fell in love with at first sight at a town party. Alora was the daughter of the Dawsons, a middle-class family owning one of Flagstaff's largest general stores. They were proud of Alora, beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious. But from the start, I sensed their dissatisfaction with me. To the Dawsons, I was just a veterinarian, a man who made a living tending to livestock instead of building an empire like my father. Alora once said she loved my simplicity, my gentleness with horses, and my patience with our young daughter, Andrea. But 6 years of marriage revealed cracks. Alora began comparing me to other men, those with grand ambitions who built something significant like my father. Her parents didn't help. They always looked at me with scrutiny as if I'd never be worthy of their daughter. "What can a veterinarian do, Stetson?" Mrs. Dawson once asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you going to let Alora live in that little house forever?" I tried to ignore it, tried to believe our love was strong enough to withstand the whispers. But deep down, I knew Alora was waiting for me to become something greater, something I wasn't sure I wanted to be. But life didn't let me rest. Everything changed one June morning, as golden sunlight spread across Flagstaff's hills. I was at the veterinary clinic stitching up a dog's wound from a fence when my phone rang. My mother's voice, Margaret, trembled on the other end. "Stetson, come home now. Your father. He had an accident while riding." I raced to my car, my heart pounding as if it might burst. On the drive to the ranch, I tried to imagine what had happened. My father was a master horseman called the King of the Plains by the region. He had taught me how to hold the reins, feel a horse's rhythm, and stand firm no matter how fast it galloped. How could he have had an accident? When I arrived, the Boone Ranch was shrouded in gloom. The hired hands stood silently at the gate, their cowboy hats lowered. My mother sat in an armchair in the living room, her eyes red but maintaining her characteristic calm. Marshall stood beside her, his face rigid, showing no emotion. Then she spoke, her voice choked. "Your father. This morning, while riding, his horse spooked, reared up, and threw him off. He hit his head on a rock nearby. The doctor said he didn't make it. It felt like the world collapsed. My father, the man who seemed invincible, was gone. Just hours ago, he was riding his favorite horse, Black Thunder, across the fields he loved more than life itself. I couldn't believe it, couldn't accept it. I wanted to scream, to run to the stables for answers, but my feet felt frozen. Marshall looked at me, his eyes cold. "Don't make this worse, Stetson. Now's not the time to be weak." My father's funeral took place 3 days later at a small church on the outskirts of Flagstaff. It was simple, heartfelt, just like him. Not ostentatious, but full of weight. The whole town turned out, from poor farmers to wealthy businessmen, all wanting to say goodbye to Jerome Boone. They spoke of how he helped them through hard times, built schools for kids, and always kept his word. I stood among the crowd, listening to their praise, my heart heavy. I loved my father, but I feared him too. I respected him, but I never felt good enough in his eyes. Among the mourners, I saw pitying glances directed at me. They knew I was Jerome Boone's youngest son, but they also knew I wasn't like Marshall. No ambition, no charisma. An elderly woman, the owner of the town bakery, took my hand and said, "You were his pride, Stetson. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I forced a smile, but inside I didn't believe her. If I was truly my father's pride, why did I always feel like the extra in this family? After the funeral, as the sunset fell, I stood alone by the stables watching Black Thunder graze. I stroked his muzzle, seeking comfort in his warm breath. But in my mind, memories of my father flooded back. The times he taught me to ride, the times he scolded me for messing up, and the rare moments he smiled, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said, "You'll find your path, Stetson. But you have to find it yourself." I didn't know that just days later that path would open in a way I never expected. My father left behind a vast fortune, but also a storm that would sweep our family into a clash between honor and greed. And I, Stetson Boone, would face challenges I was never prepared for. About a week after the funeral, I received a call from my mother. Her voice was calm, but there was an urgency to it, as if she were holding back something significant. "Stetson, come to Boone Mansion this afternoon. The lawyer will read your father's will." I nodded over the phone, saying I'd rearrange my schedule and be there early. Deep inside, a sense of unease crept in. My father's will, the subject of speculation across Flagstaff since his passing, would determine the fate of the Boone estate. But I didn't dare hope for much. I knew I wasn't the son my father trusted to carry on his empire. As I drove to Boone Mansion, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the red dirt road leading to the ranch. The mansion stood grandly amidst the fields, its intricately carved wooden pillars and vibrant red-tiled roof a symbol of our family's power. But today it felt oppressive, like I was walking into an arena. Alora, my wife, sat beside me, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. She had insisted on coming along, though I told her it was a private Boone family matter. "I'm your wife, Stetson," she said, her voice trembling. "I have a right to know what our future holds." I didn't want to argue, so I agreed. What I didn't expect was that she'd bring her parents, the Dawsons, along, people who always looked at me with scrutiny, as if I'd never be worthy of their daughter. We entered the living room of Boone Mansion, where the scent of oak and leather lingered, a reminder of evenings when my father sat there, smoking cigars and discussing business. My mother, Margaret, was already there, sitting upright in a large armchair, her sharp eyes tinged with exhaustion. Marshall stood near the fireplace, arms crossed, a half-smile on his face as if he already knew what was coming. The family lawyer, Mr. Harold Grayson, a thin man with thick glasses, stood in the center of the room holding a stack of documents. He looked at the crowd, my mother, Marshall, me, Alora, and her parents, then frowned. "I thought this reading was for those named in the will only," he said, his voice dry. Alora gripped my hand, squeezing so tightly it hurt. "I'm Stetson's wife. I need to be here," she said, her voice almost pleading. The Dawsons stood behind her, nodding in agreement. Mr. Grayson started to object, but my mother raised a hand, her voice gentle but firm. "Let them stay, Harold. The more transparency, the better." I looked at my mother, searching for some comfort in her eyes, but she only gave a faint smile, as if preparing for something I wasn't ready for. We sat down, the air in the room heavy, like a stone pressing on my chest. Mr. Grayson opened the documents, cleared his throat, and began reading my father's will. His voice was steady, but each word hit me like a hammer blow. "I, Jerome Boone, leave the entirety of the ranch, the estates, Boone Enterprises, and Boone Mansion to my eldest son, Marshall Boone." Marshall stood taller, his smile widening, triumphant. I heard whispers from the Dawsons, and Alora's grip on my hand tightened, as if trying to keep me from falling into an abyss. Mr. Grayson continued, his voice slowing as he looked at me. "To my youngest son, Stetson Boone, I leave the wooden cabin on the western edge of the estate along with the surrounding land." Silence. A deathly silence enveloped the room. I felt the blood in my veins stop flowing. That wooden cabin, a dilapidated shack, abandoned since my grandfather's time, a place even rats didn't bother visiting. That was all my father left me. After years of living in his shadow, in Marshall's shadow, in the shadow of the Boone family, all I got was a pile of rotting wood. Marshall broke the silence with a low, sharp laugh, as cutting as a blade. "Well, Stetson, looks like Dad knew what suited you best," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. I looked at him, wanting to say something, to scream that this wasn't fair, but my throat was dry. I just sat there, frozen like a trapped animal under the gaze of the entire room. Then came my wife's family. Mrs. Dawson, Alora's mother, let out a theatrical sigh loud enough for everyone to hear. "I told you, Alora. He'll never amount to anything." Mr. Dawson nodded, his eyes looking at me like I was a failure. "A veterinarian, He can treat horses, but he can't provide for his wife and child." Alora said nothing, but her eyes, God, those eyes, were like a dagger to my heart. It wasn't anger, wasn't sadness, but deep disappointment. as if she had just realized she'd bet her life on a loser. My mother sat there silent, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I wanted her to speak, to defend me, but she only looked at me, her eyes seeming to say, "Be strong, son." But I couldn't be strong. I felt stripped bare in front of both families, exposed as a useless nobody, unworthy of the Boone name. No one said another word. Mr. Grayson folded the documents, nodded politely, and left. Marshall patted my shoulder as he passed, a heavy pat that felt like it was meant to crush me into the ground. "Congrats on your cabin, little brother," he said, his voice sweet but venomous. The Dawsons stood, pulling Alora along. She didn't look at me, didn't say a word, just walked away, her shoulders trembling. When the room was left with just me and my mother, she took my hand. "Stetson," she said, her voice gentle but resolute, "your father never did anything without a reason. Be patient." I wanted to believe her, but at that moment I only felt a burning pain in my chest. I had lost my father, and now it felt like I was losing my family, my wife, my daughter, and even myself. The drive from Boone Mansion back home had never felt so long. I drove in silence, the silvery moonlight streaming through the window, but it couldn't soothe the icy pain in my heart. Alora sat beside me, her hands still clenched, but no longer seeking comfort from me. It was tension, anger, perhaps even despair. The Dawsons followed in their own car, and I knew a real confrontation awaited me once the door to our home closed. We stepped into our small house, the house I once thought was warm enough for a family of 3. But now, with only me, Alora, and her parents, it became a battlefield. Alora stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes red but no longer trembling as they had at Boone Mansion. Instead, there was a hardness I'd never seen in her. "Stetson," she said, her voice cold as ice, "you've let me down. You've let my entire family down." I stood there, speechless. Her words were another knife, cutting deeper into the wounds still bleeding from the afternoon. Before I could respond, Mrs. Dawson stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "You're a penniless failure, Stetson," she nearly shouted. "Do you think we let Alora marry you to live in some rotting wooden shack? You've got nothing. No money, no future, not even dignity." Mr. Dawson stood behind her, silent, but his eyes were sharper than his wife's words, as if declaring me a mistake, a blemish on their daughter's life. I wanted to argue, to say I didn't need my father's fortune to prove my worth. I wanted to say I loved Alora, loved Andrea, and had done everything in my power to make them happy. But the words stuck in my throat. I just stood there, helpless, watching my wife's family turn their backs on me. Alora faced me, her voice softer but resolute. "I've thought it through. I'm taking Andrea and leaving. I can't let her grow up in this kind of poverty. I'll send you the divorce papers, Stetson. It's over." She walked to the door, not looking back. The Dawsons followed, offering no goodbye. The door slammed shut, and the sound echoed in my head like a hammer driving a nail into a coffin. I stood frozen in the living room, listening to their car fade down the dirt road. The house suddenly felt too vast, too empty. Years of marriage, shared memories, now reduced to a legal document and a contemptuous glance. I sank into a chair, my trembling hands cradling my head. My father was gone, and now my wife had left me, taking Andrea, the only light in my life. I hadn't just lost my inheritance, I had lost the people I loved most. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the pitch-black fields, searching for a reason to go on. Marshall's words, the Dawsons', Alora's, they swirled in my mind like a storm. Penniless failure, never amount to anything, one loser. Those words carved themselves into my thoughts, making me question if I truly was as worthless as they claimed. I thought of my father, of the times he looked at me with disappointment, comparing me to Marshall. Did he think the same? Was that rotting wooden cabin his way of telling me I wasn't worthy of the Boone name? Amid the chaos in my mind, my phone lit up. A text from my mother. "Stetson, go to the wooden cabin your father left you. He never did anything without a reason. Trust me." I stared at the screen, wanting to find comfort in her words, but they were like a drop of water in the fire consuming me. That wooden cabin, a crumbling relic, a reminder of my failure. How could it hold answers? But my mother was the only one who hadn't turned her back on me today. That alone was enough to make me cling to a sliver of hope, however faint. I closed my eyes and memories of my father flooded in like a river. I remembered afternoons when he taught me to ride, his voice stern but never impatient. "Hold the reins firm, Stetson, but don't grip too tight. A horse is like a man. It needs room to breathe." Once when I fell hard, scraping my knees and crying, he didn't scold me. He knelt down, wiped the wound with his old handkerchief and said, "You fall, you get up. A Boone man doesn't stay down and complain." Those moments, though rare, were precious gems in my memory. My father was harsh, but he had moments of tenderness he never showed Marshall. Did he see something in me that I never saw in myself? But those warm memories weren't enough to ease the current pain. I felt like an injured horse left alone in a cold, desolate field. Alora had left, taking Andrea, taking the dreams of a happy family I once believed were real. Her family saw me as a failure, and Marshall, with his triumphant smile, had taken everything I ever hoped for. My mother told me to be patient, but patient for what when the whole world seemed to have turned against me? I stood stepping onto the porch, letting the cold night wind whip my face. Somewhere in the darkness, that dilapidated wooden cabin was waiting. I didn't know what it held, but I knew I couldn't stay here, in a house filled with the cracks of failure. Maybe, just maybe, my father had left an answer in that wreckage. The next day, the June sun scorched Flagstaff with oppressive heat, the air thick and heavy with each breath. I decided to drive my old pickup truck to the western edge of the estate, where the wooden cabin stood silently amidst a field of wild grass. The narrow, dusty road was flanked by dry shrubs and knee-high weeds. When I pulled up to the gate, the sight before me was one of decay. The rusted iron gate leaned precariously as if a strong gust could topple it. The cabin beyond was no better. Its tiled roof shattered, wooden walls weathered and peeling, windows caked with grime like an old beast awaiting death. I stood there, gripping the steering wheel, wondering why I had come. To find answers? Or to face yet another testament to my failure? I stepped out of the truck, my boots kicking up dust as I waded through the weeds. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, a grating sound like a warning. Inside, the cabin was even worse than I'd imagined. The wooden floor was rotting, groaning under each step. The smell of mold and aged wood stung my nose, forcing me to cover my mouth. I walked through the main room where faint light from the windows illuminated peeling walls. An old table sat abandoned in a corner, blanketed in a thick layer of dust. This was my inheritance, a pile of ruins my father deemed I deserved. But then, as I stepped into the small kitchen at the back, I noticed something odd. A floorboard near an old fireplace was misaligned, as if it had been shifted multiple times. I knelt down, my hand brushing the rough wood. There were faint scratches, not from time, but from deliberate tampering. My heart beat faster. I pried the floorboard loose, revealing a small, rusted but sturdy iron door with an old lock. I hesitated, feeling as if I stood before a secret I wasn't ready to uncover. But my mother's words echoed in my mind. "Your father never did anything without a reason." I searched the room, found a rusted metal rod in a corner, and used it to break the lock. The iron door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the truck, its weak beam sweeping across dust-covered steps. Each step echoed in the confined space as if I were entering another world. At the bottom was a small stone-walled cellar, the air heavy and cold. I scanned the room with the flashlight, and then the beam stopped on a large steel chest in the corner. It wasn't some ancient relic, but a modern, solid safe, designed to protect something valuable. I knelt before it, my heart pounding. The chest had a combination lock. I turned the dials, my pulse racing. I tried familiar numbers. My father's birthday, my mother's, even that of his favorite horse. All wrong. My hands were slick with sweat, but in a moment of desperation I entered my own birthday. A sharp click sounded. The lock sprang open. My father had chosen the day of my birth to guard his greatest secret. My trembling hands lifted the lid, knowing that from this moment nothing would be the same. As the lid opened, the flashlight's beam reflected off the contents, nearly stealing my breath. Gold bars. Dozens, perhaps hundreds, neatly stacked, gleaming like stars in the darkness. I touched one, feeling its cold, heavy weight. This wasn't a small treasure. It was worth millions, maybe tens of millions of dollars. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. This rotting wooden cabin, the object of everyone's ridicule, held a colossal fortune. But then my eyes caught a brown paper envelope resting neatly atop the gold. I recognized my father's handwriting instantly. Bold, precise, unmistakable. My hands shook as I opened it, pulling out a handwritten letter. His words appeared before me as if he were standing there, speaking from beyond the grave. Stetson, my son, if you're reading this letter, you've found the cellar. This gold is part of the Boone estate, but it isn't clean. It comes from deals I made years ago, deals I'm not proud of. I left it here not to make you rich, but to test you. You have the power to decide. Keep it and live with the secret, or bring it to light and face the consequences. Do what your conscience tells you. I trust you'll choose right. Your father. I slumped onto the cellar floor, the letter trembling in my hands. Each word hit me like a hammer to the mind. This gold could change everything. I could use it to prove to Alora, to the Dawsons, to Marshall that I wasn't a failure. I could bring Andrea back, build a new life, and reclaim the dignity I'd been stripped of. But then, another voice spoke within me. My own voice, my conscience. If this gold was truly unclean, keeping it would be betraying the values I held dear. My father had tested me not with wealth, but with character. I sat there in the dark cellar, the flashlight's beam glinting off the gold. My heart was torn between two paths, one promising wealth and validation, the other leading to truth but possibly ruin. I thought of my father, his stern but hopeful eyes. I thought of my mother, her trust in me to be true to myself. And I thought of Andrea, her innocent eyes looking at me like I was her hero. I had to choose, not just for myself but for her, for the Boone family, and for my own soul. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath, feeling the cellar's chill seep into my skin. My decision would define who I was, a man chasing the glitter of gold or one daring to live by his conscience. The nights that followed, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my small house, now emptier than ever, with my father's letter on the table. I read and reread each line, searching for a sign, a clearer direction. But my father was never one to make things easy. He always tested us in his own way, stern, uncompromising, but full of purpose. After 3 sleepless nights, I made my decision. I would take the gold and the letter to the lawyer, Mr. Harold Grayson, and if necessary, to the local authorities. I knew this could cost me everything. The gold might be confiscated, the Boone family might face an investigation, and my father's reputation could be tarnished. But I couldn't live with this secret. I didn't want Andrea to grow up with a father who chose wealth over honor. I wanted to look in the mirror and see a man I could respect, even if the world turned its back on me. That morning I returned to the wooden cabin, the harsh sunlight illuminating its crumbling walls. I carefully packed each gold bar into canvas bags, loading them onto the truck, feeling as if I were carrying my entire fate. My father's letter rested in my breast pocket, close to my heart, a reminder of the responsibility I bore. As I drove to the lawyer's office in downtown Flagstaff, my heart was heavy but strangely relieved. I was ready to face whatever consequences came. Mr. Grayson's office sat on a quiet street, a worn brass sign hanging out front. He was at his desk, his thick glasses perched low on his nose, when I walked in with a serious expression. "Stetson," he said, his voice tinged with surprise. "I didn't expect you back so soon." I placed the canvas bags on his desk, opening them to reveal the gleaming gold bars, and handed him my father's letter. "You need to read this," I said, my voice hoarse. "And I want you to check everything. I need to know the truth." Mr. Grayson read the letter, his brow furrowing, then looked up at me, his eyes probing. "Are you sure you want to do this, Stetson? If there's an issue with this gold, the consequences could be severe." I nodded, though my heart pounded. "I'm sure. I can't live with a secret." He nodded slowly, as if weighing something, then called a colleague from the local authorities. They arrived within an hour, bringing paperwork and equipment to verify the gold's origins. Time crawled by like a nightmare. I sat in a corner of the office watching men in suits examine each gold bar, flipping through documents and whispering to each other. I braced myself for the worst, that the gold might be tied to tax evasion or shady deals, and that I'd pay a price for my honesty. But then Mr. Grayson called me over, his voice calm but with a strange note. "Stetson, sit down. We need to talk." I sat across from him, feeling as if the world had narrowed to this small room. He pushed his glasses up and looked me in the eye. "I have to tell you this. The gold is completely legal," he said. "Your father, Jerome, fully documented its origins before he passed. All the paperwork, receipts, and records are in order. There's no tax evasion or illegal activity." I blinked, unable to believe my ears. "But my father's letter, he said it wasn't clean." Mr. Grayson smiled, a rare smile I'd never seen from him. "I think that was your father's test, Stetson. You know he never did things the simple way." He continued, "He wanted to see what you'd do when faced with a moral choice. Keep the gold and live with doubt, or bring it to light, even if it meant losing everything. You chose right." He pushed a stack of documents toward me, pointing to the dense text. "This gold is yours, legally and cleanly. It's part of the legacy your father left, but only for someone worthy." I sat there stunned, as if a wave had swept me out to sea and gently set me back on shore. Tears welled up, not for the gold, but because I realized my father had never looked down on me. He had seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself, integrity, a quality he valued more than any of Marshall's ambitions. The letter, the gold, the cabin, it was all a test designed to challenge my character, and I had passed. I left the office, stepping into the blazing sunlight, feeling as if an enormous weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I pulled out my phone and called my mother. When her calm voice answered, I couldn't hold back and told her everything. The cellar, the gold, the letter, and the truth Mr. Grayson had revealed. She was silent for a moment, then spoke, her voice brimming with pride. "Stetson, you've made your father proud. He always knew who you were. A true boon man." I stood in the street, tears streaming down my cheeks, but this time they were tears of release. For the first time in my life, I felt my father's recognition, not through words or looks, but through the test he had left behind. I was no longer the lazy younger brother, no longer the one scorned by the family. I was Stetson Boone, the true heir to the family, not because of the gold, but because I had stood firm against temptation. As I returned to my truck, the sunlight glinted off the gold in the bags, but they were no longer the center of my world. I had found something far more valuable: faith in myself and the true legacy my father left: honor. I knew the road ahead would still hold challenges, but for the first time I felt ready. 2 weeks had passed since I walked out of the lawyer's office, carrying the truth about the gold and a new responsibility. I didn't let myself get swept up in the allure of wealth. I continued living in my small house, still woke early to head to the veterinary clinic, still petted horses and healed injured pets. The gold, now safely stored in a bank, didn't change me. I didn't want it to change me. I still wore my old shirt, drove my dusty pickup truck, and spent evenings on the porch thinking about Andrea and how I would bring her back. My mother once said, "Money can buy many things, but only integrity buys self-respect." I wanted to live by her words. One morning, while I was checking a feverish cow at Old Man Jenkins' ranch, my phone rang. My mother's voice came through, calm but with a serious undertone. "Stetson, come to Boone Mansion this afternoon. There's something important I need to tell you." I hesitated, asking what it was, but she only replied, "Just come, you'll understand." I knew my mother never called without reason, and a gut feeling told me something significant was waiting. As I drove to Boone Mansion, the late afternoon sun bathed the sprawling fields in gold. The mansion stood grandly, but today it felt different. No longer the arena I once feared, but a place I felt I belonged. I stepped into the living room, the familiar scent of oak and leather filling my senses. But this time, the scene made me pause. My mother sat in the large armchair, her eyes sharp but serene. Marshall stood near the fireplace, his face tense, the triumphant smile from 2 weeks ago gone. And Mr. Harold Grayson, the family lawyer, stood in the center of the room, holding a new stack of documents, thicker than the previous will. My heart beat faster, but I kept my face calm, waiting. "Sit down, Stetson," my mother said, her voice gentle but commanding. I complied, my eyes shifting from her to Marshall, then to Mr. Grayson. Marshall didn't look at me, but I could see his shoulders trembling slightly, as if holding something back. My mother nodded to Mr. Grayson, and he began, his voice dry but clear. "Today I will read the most recent official will of Mr. Jerome Boone." I frowned, surprised. The most recent official will? Hadn't it been read 2 weeks ago when I was relegated to the rotting cabin? Mr. Grayson opened the documents, and as he read, the room seemed to spiral into a whirlwind. "In this will, Mr. Jerome Boone stipulates clearly, Marshall Boone shall inherit the entirety of the ranch, estates, Boone Enterprises, and Boone Mansion on the condition that he preserves and develops them for at least 1 year. If Marshall Boone attempts to sell any portion of these assets before that time, the entire inheritance will automatically transfer to Stetson Boone, the youngest son of Mr. Jerome." Silence engulfed the room. I felt the blood in my veins stop flowing. Marshall? Selling the assets? I looked at him, and for the first time I saw panic in his eyes. Mr. Grayson continued, his voice now carrying a note of gravity. "We have received verified information that Marshall Boone publicly offered to sell significant portions of the ranch and estates just days after the previous will reading. This action violates the terms of the will." The room erupted. Marshall shot to his feet, his face flushed, shouting, "This is a conspiracy. A filthy trap. Why wasn't I told about this condition from the start?" His voice trembled with helplessness and desperation. Mr. Grayson remained calm, pulling out another set of documents and placing them on the table. "These are records from real estate firms and Marshall's business partners. They confirm he initiated negotiations to sell the land, with meetings documented over the past week." Marshall turned to our mother, pointing at her, his voice breaking. "Mother! You knew about this, didn't you? And you said nothing? You and Stetson set this up to steal everything from me." My mother looked at him, her eyes cold but not angry. "Marshall," she said evenly, "your father set the rules and you broke them. This isn't a conspiracy. This is his final wish." I sat there, stunned, unable to believe what was happening. Mr. Grayson continued, his voice like a final hammer blow. "Per the terms of the will, due to Marshall Boone's violation, the entirety of the assets, including the ranch, estates, Boone Enterprises, and Boone Mansion, will be immediately transferred to Stetson Boone. Furthermore, the gold Stetson discovered in the wooden cabin, already verified as legal, will be consolidated with these assets, forming the complete Boone family legacy." Marshall screamed, slamming his fist on the table, shattering a glass of water. "No, this can't be. It's mine. I'm the heir. Stetson's just a failure, a useless veterinarian." But his words held no weight anymore. Mr. Grayson shook his head, adjusting his glasses. "This will is entirely legal, certified by the court. There's nothing to dispute, Marshall." The room descended into chaos. Marshall stormed out, shouting curses, but I barely heard him. I looked at my mother and she smiled, a gentle, proud smile. I realized that everything, The cabin, the gold, the letter, and now this will was part of my father's plan. He didn't just leave assets, he left a test of character for both brothers. Marshall, with his ambition and arrogance, had failed. I, though scorned, had passed through honesty and honor. I stood, my legs still trembling, but my heart strangely calm. I wasn't gleeful about Marshall's fall, nor smug about the vast fortune now mine. I only felt a profound clarity. My father had seen something in me I never saw. A man who didn't need glory to prove his worth. I looked at my mother and she nodded as if she'd known this all along. "You've made your father proud, Stetson," she said, her voice warm. "Now make yourself proud." The days that followed, I returned to my life, but it was no longer the same. The Boone estate was now mine. The ranch, the lands, the company, and the shimmering gold stored safely in the bank. But I didn't want wealth to change who I was. I wanted Andrea, when she returned, to see a father she could be proud of, not for money but for honesty and humility. In Flagstaff, a small town, rumors spread like wildfire through dry grass. Just days after the will's announcement, whispers began to circulate. Marshall, in his anger and desperation, went around slandering me. He told anyone who would listen that I was a greedy opportunist, a lowly veterinarian who had schemed to steal the Boone fortune. "Stetson tricked our mother, the lawyer, even our father," he declared, his voice thick with resentment in the town's bars and coffee shops. I heard these words from Mr. Jenkins, from the bakery owner, from the ranch hands. Some looked at me with suspicion, others with pity. My reputation, never particularly bright, was now tarnished by Marshall's lies. Strangely, I wasn't angry. I didn't chase after him to clear my name. Didn't try to justify myself to those whispering behind my back. I believed the truth would always find a way to speak for itself. My father had taught me that, and my mother had reinforced it. I continued my work, tending to livestock, reviewing the ranch's books and preparing myself mentally. I knew Marshall was trying to hurt me, but he couldn't take away what I had found, my self-respect. Then one afternoon, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the fields gold, a familiar car pulled up to the gate. Alora stepped out, followed by the Dawsons, and in the back seat I saw Andrea, her innocent eyes looking at me through the window. My heart ached, but I held myself together, stood up, and walked out to meet them. Alora looked different. No longer the cold, resolute woman who had left me. Her eyes were red, her hair disheveled, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "Stetson, we need to talk." I said nothing, silently opening the door to let them in and invited them to sit, though I knew this meeting wouldn't be easy. Andrea ran to me, hugging me tightly, and I held her close, feeling her warmth like a balm for every wound. But as I looked up, Alora's and the Dawsons' eyes put me on guard. Alora began, her voice choked. "Stetson, I'm sorry. I was wrong to leave you, to listen to my parents, to think you weren't good enough. I heard about what happened. The will, the gold, everything. I realized I was wrong. You're a good man, and I want to start over. Give me a chance, Stetson, for Andrea, for us." I looked at her, then at the Dawsons. Mrs. Dawson, who once called me a penniless failure, now bowed her head, her voice soft. "We were wrong, Stetson. You're a worthy man, and we want to make amends. You're now the head of the Boone family, and we respect you." Mr. Dawson nodded, adding, "Think of Andrea. She needs both a mother and a father." Their words passed over me like a breeze, leaving me unmoved. I stood, walked to the table, and pulled a manila envelope from the drawer. It was a copy of the divorce papers Alora had sent me the previous week, when she still believed I had nothing but a rotting cabin. I placed it on the table, my voice calm but resolute. "Alora, you made your choice. I've signed these papers and filed them with the court. I don't need this marriage anymore. The only thing I want to keep is custody of Andrea." Alora sank into the chair, tears streaming down her face. "Stetson, please, don't do this. I know I was wrong, but I love you." Her voice broke, but I didn't waver. I looked straight into her eyes, then at the Dawsons, who now sat speechless, their faces pale. "You called me a failure," I said, my voice steady but sharp. You turned your backs when I needed support the most. I don't need your regrets now that I have everything. I just need my daughter. As Alora stood to leave, Andrea looked up at me, her clear eyes filled with a mix of confusion and trust. Daddy, do I have to go with Mommy? She asked, her voice tiny, her small hands clutching my shirt. My heart ached. At only 5 years old, Andrea had sensed the fracture between her parents. But her tight hug, the way she nestled into me as if seeking shelter, told me she wanted to stay. No, Andrea, I whispered, stroking her hair. You'll stay with Daddy always. Her timid smile, though tinged with worry, was like sunlight breaking through clouds, confirming I had chosen right. Not just for myself, but for her. Alora hesitated, looking at Andrea and then at me, tears falling, but she didn't argue. Perhaps because she knew she no longer had the strength to fight. I knelt down, holding Andrea close, feeling her small breaths. I'll always be here for you, I whispered, and she nodded, her tiny arms wrapping tightly around my neck. Alora sobbed. The Dawsons stood and left silently, with no words left to say. As the door closed, I felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time in my life, I was in control. Not because of the estate, not because of the gold, but because I had chosen to stand firm, unmoved by flattery or tears. The months that followed were a journey filled with challenges, but also a time when I discovered the true meaning of life. The legal process with Alora was not easy. She and the Dawsons fought for custody of Andrea, citing every reason to argue I wasn't capable of being a father. But I was prepared. With the Boone estate now mine, I had the financial means to ensure a stable life for Andrea. I hired the best lawyer in Flagstaff, presenting the court with documents proving my income from the ranch and Boone enterprises, along with the legally verified gold my father left me. More importantly, I stood before the judge with a confidence I had never had before. I spoke of my journey, how I chose honesty over temptation, how I stood firm against insults and betrayal. I talked about my love for Andrea, the evenings I wanted to spend reading her stories, the mornings I wanted to take her to see the horses. The judge looked at me, his eyes gentle but sharp, and finally declared, "Stetson Boone, you are granted full custody of Andrea." As I left the courtroom, Andrea held my hand, her eyes twinkling like stars. Alora stood in the corner, her face pale with no more tears to cry. The Dawsons stood behind her, silent, their gazes lowered. They had lost all hope of clinging to me, to the Boone fortune, to any chance of reclaiming what they once scorned. I didn't look back. I took Andrea's hand, led her to the car, and drove toward the Boone ranch, the place I would now call home. Moving into Boone Mansion was an easy decision. The grand estate, with its intricately carved wooden pillars and vibrant red-tiled roof, wasn't just a symbol of the family, but a place where I felt my father's presence. My mother, Margaret, was waiting there, a smile on her face like spring sunlight. "Welcome home, Stetson," she said, embracing Andrea. From that day we lived together, me, Andrea, and my mother, amidst the vast natural expanse of the ranch where the sound of horses neighing and the scent of hay mingled in the breeze. I didn't let the fortune change me. I still wore my old shirts, still tended to the livestock myself, and still spent mornings at the veterinary clinic. I didn't want Andrea to grow up thinking money was everything. I wanted her to see that a person's worth lies in kindness, patience, and how they treat others. Each day I took her to the stables, teaching her how to pet Black Thunder, the horse my father loved. "Gently, Andrea," I said, smiling as she nestled into me. "Horses, like people, need to be loved the right way." I spent more time with Andrea, trying to create the childhood memories I had lacked. I remembered my own childhood, when my father was too busy with work and Marshall monopolized his attention. The rare moments with my father, when he taught me to ride or cleaned my wounds after a fall, were precious. I didn't want Andrea to grow up with that sense of absence. I took her fishing at the creek near the ranch, told her stories about her grandfather, about how he built the Boone Empire from nothing. I wanted her to know that our family wasn't just about wealth, but about perseverance and honor. My bond with my mother grew stronger, She, with her integrity and impartial love, understood my journey best. One evening, as Andrea slept, my mother sat with me on the porch looking out at the moonlit fields. "You've done what your father always hoped, Stetson," she said, her voice warm. "He knew you had the heart of a true Boone, not for ambition, but for doing what's right." I held her hand, feeling the strength and gentleness in her fingers. "I just wanted to make you proud," I said, and she smiled, her eyes shining with a pride I'd never seen from anyone else. But not everything was peaceful. Marshall's slander continued to spread through the town. Now living in a small apartment on the outskirts, he never stopped telling his tale of greedy Stetson to anyone who would listen. But I didn't care. I began rebuilding my reputation in the community, not by flaunting wealth, but through small acts. I repaired the school my father had funded, donated cattle to struggling farmers, and spent time talking with the ranch hands, listening to their stories. Slowly, the suspicious glances turned to respect. The bakery owner, who had held my hand at the funeral, smiled when I stopped by. "I knew it. You're Jerome Boone's son, but you're better. You have Margaret's heart." Despite Marshall's resentment, I remained calm. He could say whatever he wanted, but the truth had prevailed, as I always believed it would. I didn't seek revenge or try to bring him down. I just wanted to live by my conscience, as my father and mother had taught me. Each day I watched Andrea grow, saw her radiant smile as she ran through the fields, and knew I had chosen right. I was no longer the useless, ambitionless brother Marshall mocked, or the penniless failure in the Dawsons' eyes. I was Stetson Boone, a father, a worthy heir, and a man continuing the Boone legacy in my own way. A year passed, and I heard news about Marshall at an upscale restaurant he used to frequent. The waiter said he was now a pitiable shadow of his former self. The man who once strode with a confident smile, entrusted by our father with grand responsibilities, was now reduced to a husk. Whispers told of Marshall drowning in alcohol, spending nights in seedy bars, squandering money on card games to escape his bitterness. But his money ran out quickly, and the business associates who once flocked to him turned their backs without hesitation. The partners who revered the name Marshall Boone now avoided him like a stain. His reputation, once as radiant as the sun, lay shattered like a broken mirror. Once, while visiting Mr. Jenkins' ranch, he told me he'd seen Marshall sitting alone in a bar corner, his eyes vacant, muttering about how I had stolen everything from him. "Stetson doesn't deserve it," he'd said, his voice hoarse with liquor and resentment. But no one listened anymore. People looked at Marshall with pity, like a wounded animal unable to stand. I didn't feel triumphant hearing these stories. I only felt sorrow for the brother who was once my father's pride, but who had pushed himself into an abyss through arrogance and greed. Marshall could have kept the fortune if he had valued it, lived with honesty instead of chasing adulation, but now he lived in bitterness, clinging to resentment with no way back. Alora didn't escape her own storm either. I heard she fell into a mental crisis after the divorce proceedings. She was no longer the radiant, beautiful woman I met years ago in a sky-blue dress. She became withdrawn, often sitting alone in the Dawsons' small house, her eyes empty as if her soul had vanished. The Flagstaff community, unforgiving of mistakes, began to whisper. They mocked her for abandoning me, for chasing ambition and pride only to lose everything. She thought Stetson wasn't good enough, but look at her now, the bakery owner said, her voice dripping with sarcasm when I stopped by to buy bread for Andrea. She lost the best man she ever had. I knew Alora realized her mistake, but it was too late. She lost me not because I became richer or more powerful, but because she turned her back when I needed her most. My mother told me the Dawsons tried to help their daughter, taking her to therapists, but Alora's condition worsened. She lost faith in herself, haunted by her wrong choices, unable to escape the spiral of regret. The Dawsons, who once looked at me with contempt, were now powerless in the face of their daughter's tragedy. Seeing the woman I once loved so diminished didn't bring me joy. I only felt a deep sorrow For Alora, for what we once had, for the dreams shattered by her greed and pride. But I, Stetson Boone, chose not to be dragged into their darkness. I witnessed Marshall's and Alora's downfall, but I didn't gloat or seek revenge. I didn't want to become that kind of person. Instead, I focused on Andrea, on my mother, and on the new life I was building. Each day I took Andrea to the stables, teaching her to ride, to feel Black Thunder's rhythm. I told her about her grandfather, how he built the ranch from nothing, not to boast, but to teach her that true value lies in perseverance and honesty. Andrea's radiant laugh, her sparkling eyes as she ran through the fields, showed me I was giving her the childhood memories I never had. My mother, Margaret, remained my steadfast anchor. She often sat with me in the evenings as moonlight bathed Boone Mansion, and we talked about my father, about the lessons he left. "You passed your father's test, Stetson," she said once, her eyes shining with pride. "But more importantly, you passed your own." I held her hand, feeling the strength and gentleness in her fingers. She was right. My father didn't just leave a fortune, he left a harsh but profound lesson. Greed and arrogance lead to ruin, while integrity and humility pave the right path. I looked back on my journey, from a scorned veterinarian called a penniless failure to the head of the Boone family. But I didn't see myself as victorious because of the gold or the ranch. I triumphed because I chose to live by my conscience, by the lessons my father and mother taught me. My father's test wasn't just about dividing the estate. It was about teaching Marshall and me how to be men worthy of the Boone name. Marshall failed, but I stood firm. Not because I was better, but because I chose to believe in what was right. I stood on the porch, watching Andrea run through the fields, her laughter echoing like a healing melody. My mother stood beside me, smiling, and I knew this was the true Boone legacy. Not money, not land, but love, integrity, and faith in the path you choose. I would continue writing my story, not to prove anything to the world, but to live true to Andrea, to my mother, and to myself. The storm had passed, and I, Stetson Boone, had found my own sunlight.